Merry Christmas. Now we got the pleasantries out of the way, let's look at the Christmas Invasion, Doctor Who's first ever Christmas special. Unless you count the Feast of Stephen. Which I don't. So this is the first ever Christmas special, but in a way it's more important than that. In one very obvious way and one less obvious way. The more obvious way is it was also the introduction of the 10th Doctor, and therefore the first time NuWho would be covering a regeneration, and the introduction of a new Doctor through that, rather than starting out with the 9th Doctor as they did. The less obvious way was this was NuWho in a place it hadn't yet been. Its first series had some uncertainty about it. It was still a question whether Doctor Who could survive returning to television and survive its new format, and therefore it's easy to look at the whole thing with a sense this was all still a bold foray into new territory. This Christmas special was for the first time NuWho coming on its own terms, with the assurance that a revival had been a success already there. It was Doctor Who perhaps with the shackles removed, and yet you wouldn't be able to tell that just by watching it. This feels very much like an Eccleston episode, only with Tennant in the title role, as it has the same general feeling about it that the first series did, and the second would evolve eventually in a very different direction than this. The focus on Rose's family unit, for instance, that's a very first series kind of affair, whereas the dynamic became very different as you went on into the second. The Christmas specials as a whole I think have rarely been NuWho at its best, and the partial problem with this was that from a certain point, cough cough, Moffat era, cough cough, they sort of forgot this is meant to be Christmas entertainment, which still in 2024 is one of the few instances in which a family might actually sit around a telly to watch, something ubiquitous even in 2005 but pretty much unheard of today in the streaming era. The idea of having a bit of fun family entertainment which plays into the spirit of the time of year does not come across all that effectively when we're watching a psychological horror of facehuggers, funnily enough. Moffat, though, was responsible for an episode that did get it, The Husbands of River Song, which combined a Christmassy plot with some humour but also some heart and drama as well. It was flawed, no doubt, but it got the memo. Which makes the next one in line, The Return of Dr. Mysterio, even more frustrating because of how it just lost the intrigue and emotion and became a farce. But it's a difficult balance, sure, but you'd think someone would have worked it out at some point. In any case, though, this episode gets a pass from all that because this is the first one, and some finding of the feet is understandable and to be expected, not least because of that other task it had. So this is the rare Christmas special which can probably be judged for entirely for what it is rather than how it works as part of the mould it's supposed to be set in. I'll give the episode this, that it was actually better than I remembered it being and there's quite a few solid elements to it. In fact, it's only really let down by the resolution of most of those elements in typical NuWho fashion, but there are a few reasons why those elements work better than I thought they would. Firstly, there's a lot of focus on character in the first half of the episode, which gives the events more depth than they otherwise would have. Secondly, there's a great deal of tension and mystery in the first half, which does all add up in a rather satisfying way. And thirdly, it does portray the Doctor's post-regenerative state in a new light, and use it to explore some interesting ideas in the first half of the episode. You might also have noticed I'm saying the first half of the episode a lot, and well, there might be a reason for that, but we'll get to that. Anyway, I'll look quickly at the production side as always. The director here was James Hawes, who directed a few episodes in series 1 and 2, including School Reunion, which we've already covered. He didn't do anything else after that, though. His job here is mostly fine, it's not standout or anything, but it's rarely noticeably bad, and I have to admit the pacing of the episode was remarkably on point, for which I think he deserves a great deal of praise. And well, let's be honest, nobody was making that 2005 CGI Christmas tree look any good. There are a few duff moments, the editing in the finale sword fight is pretty poor, and you do get the feeling Hawes might have lost his grip on the story around the time Russell T Davies did when he was doing the script, but ultimately I think it's fine. It's not going to jump into the list of best directed stories, but it's certainly not one you'd call bad. It's fine. Other elements of the production, I mean the set design is okay. The Sycorax ship set must have been a cool idea in their heads, but it honestly looks a little generic in practice, but, it could be worse. Such as the effects work, which is just funny in how badly aged it is. I mean, wow, PS2 graphics doesn't even begin to cover it. I mean, yeah, I get this was of its time, and the classic series does have the same problem with its model work, but bad CGI is always going to be inherently worse than bad model making, because a bad model still looks like a real thing, even if it just looks like a model, whereas bad CGI looks like the characters have suddenly entered the video game, so no, it's not very good. Speaking of not very good, look, it does sometimes sound like I have it in for Murray Gold, and I really don't. There's a lot of work of his I really like, but we just seem to be always hitting the episodes where he did a bad job, and here, well, for a start, he's still stuck in the Series 1 format, where his music always did feel a little bit off. I'm pretty sure this was because it was computer-generated rather than actually orchestrated, and yeah, you could always tell. The general feeling here is the same, but it's less that I'm on about, and more just like some of the bizarre decisions he makes. Like the Christmas tree attract scene. On paper a pretty farcical moment and the bad effects don't help, so good music was very important in trying to prevent this from coming across as just completely ridiculous. And So, mission not accomplished there. This scene just comes across as impossible to take seriously, which would have been fine if it was the intent, but A, it's clearly not, and B, this music still would have failed because it's just too on the nose to work that way. Another bizarre decision is when all the control people are all walking off. Again, a fairly bizarre moment that needed a lot of care to get the shock and creepiness value it was clearly going for, and we get this really odd sounding music that seems to be more like the backdrop to a Christmas carol than what would underscore the moment. So yeah, not a fan of the music in this one at all. As for the script then, well, it's clear RTD wasn't quite sure how to approach this, which as I said earlier is fine given this is the first special and all that, but it does nevertheless mean it feels a bit like a mishmash of different styles and elements. Which is of course a standard for the Christmas specials since, which is rather less excusable given it's now sort of known what has to be done, but nevertheless for this episode he was firing in the dark a bit. I'll give him credit definitely, this episode is flawed, but it nevertheless ends up as fairly watchable and even in places interesting, as much of a curse as that can be for NuWho, despite basically having a laundry list of things to do, and hey, credit where it's due. That won't stop me pillorying the idiot bits of the episode that he clearly did not think through, because, well, still me, but I'll admit I have not watched this episode in a long time, I was expecting it to be a lot naffer than it actually was. I'll start by looking at some of the positives. The first half or so of the episode is actually pretty decent. It takes the situation of the post-regeneration Doctor and uses it to drive some rather interesting drama. Firstly, RTD uses the opportunity of the new audience's unfamiliarity of how the post-regeneration stuff goes down to keep it shrouded in a bit of mystery, which is a good way of driving that early drama. The Doctor goes to bed, we see some orange wispy stuff that will track with the orange glow we saw the Ninth Doctor regenerate in, but that's it. The rest of it is left to the imagination of the new audience and helps them identify with Rose, who's a bit stuck not really knowing what's going on and what she needs to do. When the Doctor wakes again, it's the perfect time to learn a little bit more, mostly that what is going on is normal, but not to blow the whole thing. It still leaves a lot of questions that are eventually answered when the Doctor wakes up much later in the episode. This also drives the character drama. Rose is both being forced back into her home life she had spent our whole first year trying to escape from, and is also having to guard the Doctor and work out how much she relies on him. Her frustration with the situation and losing the person she'd rely on the most causes her to lash out more than once, and I do like it when RTD actually highlights Rose's character flaws, instead of, just ignoring them and pretending she's wonderful, as he'd do throughout most of the series too. For instance, basically telling her mum her life with her is worthless, which I think qualifies as a tad insensitive. It shows she has been changed for the good and the bad, and gives her stuff to overcome. Unfortunately, the second half of the episode doesn't really bother to resolve any of these arcs, and Rose seems to learn the square root of bugger all, but this sort of plays into the main theme of this episode, but it starts much stronger than it finishes. For instance, the interactions between Rose and Jackie do belie the fact that Rose is losing sight of her roots and is forgetting all the people at home that do actually matter to her, whether she remembers they do or not. But the situation of the Doctor's condition has forced her back into it. Her frustration at this does boil over, and her journey to recognising this and appreciating what her mum is doing, which is not an inconsiderate amount, remember, does feel like it's progressing. But then it all just sort of stops once the big spaceship turns up. Jackie disappears from the episode more or less, and it goes completely unresolved. The Doctor is awake again, Rose can go back to being with him, that's that. It is disappointing that RTT started reasonably well, but then decided spaceships and sword fights could finish it off. Rose's character as a whole is also a victim of this. Again, it starts being about her, being stuck between her two lives and frustrated by both being cut out from the one she prefers by the Doctor's condition, and being forced to confront the things he usually did on her own, and finding she's not ready for it. A great moment, I think, is actually when she looks at the alien invasion going on, decides to go and panic and hide, showing that she's not ready to do this without the Doctor. Unfortunately, once again, the second half comes around, and RTD first of all takes it way too far by having her embarrass herself in front of the Sycorax, which just feels like it's showing us what we've already seen more effectively and doing a way that's just frankly embarrassing to watch. And then the Doctor wakes up and the whole thing is forgotten and not resolved. She's alright now, the Doctor is awake again, and she doesn't need to learn how to act when he's not around, because he is now. Oh, look, sword fights! Yeah, it starts out very strong and falters again. I'll also give credit to Billie Piper here. I've said before that whatever issue I had with the character of Rose, it doesn't reflect on her performance, and, well, it's just a shame her arc could have been, an arc, rather than going up and not coming down again. Only NuWho could break the laws of physics with its fucking up. The first half of the episode also does a great job in setting up the threat. It's very well paced with the ominous strip feeding of more and more bad news. It's not all perfect, the initial shot of the space probe being grabbed by the giant rock ship is let down by bad effects and the fact that, well, it's just a bit silly. But watching the situation progressively deteriorate as the threat gets worse and worse and we work out that humanity is kind of totally screwed, works really well in creating an atmosphere of dread and tension. Which is what is always needed to punctuate the fact that the Doctor can't come along to just bail them out of it, as always. The translation stuff, I think, is also a very clever way of punctuating this, as without the Doctor, the TARDIS can't do the translating for them, and thus even the thing we've always taken for granted on the show, the aliens being able to speak BBC English, is not there. Which makes the fact that we have to wait to work out in which precise way we are boned after hearing the ominous growling and shouting from the baddies on the screen add to the atmosphere even more. It also gives these aliens a sense of true monstrosity, that while in much of the first series the aliens have been humanised to an extent, as early as the second episode the Doctor was talking to a tree like you would talk to anyone, and that's because, they were, But now all we get from these aliens is guttural growling and the aide translating it, which further deepens the feeling of how screwed they are. Hell, even the controlled people walking into the building edge scene, which is a very bizarre moment that doesn't quite work on the screen, nevertheless you get the idea it's trying to add to that feeling, and it works in part. This is a situation that without the Doctor is not winnable. There are other elements that are less successful here, mind. The pilot fish stuff is a cool concept and a cool single line, we get the shark and stuff, but I mean they look pretty stupid. I mean, yeah, you don't want a Christmas special to all be dark, there's got to be some relief, but I prefer that was like a bit of fun or even comedy, not Santas with trumpet guns, which is only funny in a what the fuck were they thinking kind of way. The killer Christmas tree also falls into the same category, and frankly I think should have been ejected, as it adds nothing other than waking the Doctor up, which could have been done by combining this bit with the attack on Rose and Mickey by the Santas, and takes the building momentum of dread and does rather kill it stone dead, but these are just missteps rather than huge problems. I'll also say that this episode does have a big advantage over much of NuWho. It's an hour rather than 45 minutes, and so it has an extra 15 minutes to actually take its time when it needs to, and the reason this stuff does work is because half the episode can be afforded to the build-up, when usually this would have had to been tossed off very quickly. So that's a sign of RTD using the format it's been given right, and I do give credit where it's due. The other important bit of the first half of the episode is the Harriet Jones stuff, but we'll get to that in a moment. So that does bring us to the second half, which is when things start to fall apart. For a start, the Sycorax I don't think are a particularly interesting villain once they actually start doing things other than producing dread. They're quite one-dimensional, don't have any motivation beyond being evils. Making them space warriors with honor codes, I mean, it would have been a dull cliche, but it would have been something, and at least made the sword fight a little more of a natural development rather than just being thrown in. You get the feeling that's even what they're trying to go for, but it just doesn't really translate. Getting the TARDIS and the Doctor in a position he needs to be to wake up is so hilariously contrived. It's basically just people accidentally knocking things and spilling things until he's woken up by tea. Yeah, sure, whatever. And then the 10th Doctor has his first adventure, and it's pretty lame. The rubbish sword fight, as I said, with hilarious contrivances. Maybe I can forgive a magic ability to regrow limbs. What I'm less willing to forgive is the make floor go away button he uses to drop head Sycorax after the fight, because clearly no spaceship is complete with one of those, on the outside of the ship no less. This also brings me to another problem. I think RTD had just no idea how to write the 10th Doctor at this point, and it does feel like a bit of a hodgepodge. Tennant is doing what he can with it, and it's clear that many of the 10th Doctor's quirks come from him. The humour, for instance, is on display here. But, the sensitive, emotional man, desperately trying to put the past behind him, that the Doctor would eventually be in this incarnation, it's just not really here. Instead, we get...
No second chances. I'm that sort of a man.
Yeah, that didn't go anywhere, did it? This Doctor never really displayed a ruthless streak like that. I mean, for fuck's sake, he ended up trying to save Davros from a burning ship, so that never really went anywhere. It's not a bad moment in itself, but it's one that would have fit the 9th Doctor much better, and I think RTD wasn't quite sure how to separate this new Doctor from the previous one yet. This also leads into the stuff of Harriet Jones, which I'll get to in a bit. That's not to say these bits are totally without merit. The scenes with Harriet Jones on the ship as the situation just becomes more and more desperate until the Doctor appears do continue the dread feeling, and certainly give an earned sense of triumph when he does step through the TARDIS doors. I also like that the blood control thing turned out to be a bluff. I think that's a clever twist, and highlights how important the Doctor is to Earth in these situations. In it, without him, they almost fell for it, and well, who could have blamed them? The explanation itself is little pants. Oh, the survival instinct would prevent it, and it seems a bit convenient, but oh well, overall I think it's a solid twist. So, with literally everything else out of the way, I suppose we better talk about Harriet Jones. Bringing back a familiar face from the year before was not a bad idea in itself, but while I concede I'm not sure there were many other options, I don't think we actually needed to see more of her, if I'm honest. Her ending in the first story was fine, and the promise of her being the PM of the Golden Age, or whatever it was, would have been fine on its own. But here we're seeing her in action, and that has its ups and downs. It's nice to see her as the confident leader we were assured she could be, and she certainly does sell that she knows what she's doing, but she never loses her humanity either, in the sense that when she's confronted with these aliens, she's clearly terrified but holding her nerve, which I think is a great way to portray a leader, and indeed very Doctor Who. It goes back into the 3rd Doctor's quote, the being brave is not a matter of not being afraid, it's how you react to it. The problems, though, come twofold. Firstly, as soon as the Doctor appears, she's shunted to the back and not really heard from again until the menace has been thwarted, which I think is a mistake given her story so far in the episode has been about her dealing with this alien threat on her own terms. While she does get a conclusion to that, as we'll shortly see, the fact she spends no time at all taking part in the thwarting means that the arc does feel a little unresolved despite that. The second problem? Once the Sycorax have been defeated and been postured at by the Doctor, they teleport everyone down and bugger off. During the episode, Harriet Jones has been talking about getting Torchwood to do something ominous for her, and now she orders him to do it. A giant fuck-off laser that destroys the Sycorax ship. The Doctor is quite cross at her for doing this, especially because he had basically told them, Yeah, you can leave, okay, and go and tell the universe that Earth is protected by me. This... this is just so close to being genius. It's painfully close. The potential of this idea, not just for this episode, but also for the future, which is squandered, it just baffles the mind. All RTD had to do, all he had to do, was make it so that this becomes a point of contention between them both, in a way that allows the idea to be looked at and explored. Because this is a genuine dilemma, and one that I think RTD's actual approach, that the Doctor is definitely right and Harriet Jones is definitely wrong, just sells utterly short. We're never for a moment given the chance to think about it, to explore it. We're just told what the answer is, which I think is a huge mistake, because this is a fascinating quandary to explore, right? On the one hand, the Doctor is completely right. That was murder. They had already won, and attacking a retreating enemy in this scenario could quite possibly be considered a war crime. But on the other hand, Harriet Jones has the duty of her country and the whole world to think about, not just her duty to the Doctor. She's completely right that they don't know when they will face a threat without the Doctor being there to bail them out, and making sure those threats are aware that the Earth can defend itself is necessary to make sure that doesn't happen, because, after all, this time, they got lucky. For all we know, only those 2 people on the ship died and no one else. What about next time if a ship comes along and starts bombarding the planet from orbit? What will the Doctor do then when he comes back to find that in his absence millions of people died? After all, in 2 years' time, we have an episode called Turn Left, don't we? Where we see what happened where the Doctor was not there. And it wasn't very pleasant, was it? And it's not as if the Sycorax were in any way sympathetic or understandable either. They came here to enslave the human race and are skulking off because they lost. Who's to say instead of heeding the Doctor's warning, that they won't just come back with more ships once the Doctor has gone to try again? I mean, sure, they know the blood ship won't work again, but they'll just try brute force, one imagines. And yet, is it not possible all Harriet Jones has done is prove the Earth is dangerous and can't be tolerated as a threat to those species out there, and they will come in numbers too big for the space laser to deal with? Either way, this incident has put the Earth on the map. Is it better to be seen as helpless and needing the protection of this one man and being vulnerable when he's not there, or dangerous and barbaric enough to destroy a retreating enemy? This also should be informing her character. Early on in the episode we saw the pressure it was putting her under. Perhaps this is her cracking under that pressure and taking the easy, yet barbaric, yet in her view necessary option. Well, they're all interesting ideas, but that's entirely coming from me and not the episode, where Harriet Jones just did it because she likes explosions, and her arguments, which, while unreasonable in their way and nevertheless understandable from her point of view, are treated as the ramblings of a warmongering lunatic. Do not misunderstand me. I am not saying she was in the right. I am saying this is worthy of discussion and exploration, and needs to reach the conclusion that she was not right through that, not just telling me because the script says so. And this leads to the stupidest moment of the entire episode, the Doctor promising he can bring down her government in 6 words.
Don't you think she looks tired?
No, not particularly. And that should be that. But apparently, saying someone looks a bit tired to an aide who would have absolutely no incentive to repeat what he said to anyone, never mind spread it in the way that would cause it to become a national scandal in that way, is enough to bring her down as PM. Even though looking a bit tired has brought down precisely 0 Prime Ministers in our history. If she did, it would be completely understandable, given she's just dealt with a national crisis. And remember, in America, it took being an octogenarian who couldn't string a bloody sentence together to be removed as a party nominee recently, so I think it would take a bit more than looking a bit tired. To say this is unbelievable is putting it mildly, and the fact that I'm supposed to take this at face value is frankly absurd. Do you know how I would have done this? Just bin the kiddish Christmas tree bit, and use the extra time to explore the stuff further about the laser, to have a real discussion and explore a moral issue, and then the Doctor does the "do you think she looks tired" bit. Except it doesn't bring her down. It doesn't work. Ooh. Suddenly the Doctor learns about his own fallibilities, and maybe he's not quite as powerful and sure as he thought he was. And it does also mean that we have someone the Doctor can butt heads with, someone who the moral issues he's bring up can be explored in the future. Harriet Jones doesn't have to sit there and decide she was entirely right. She can be as torn up about it as the audience should be. She should be constantly thinking, did I make the right choice? And this should come up again, her questioning that. And that would be a fascinating way to explore these characters in the future. But no, she looks a bit tired. Except she doesn't really. And that's the end of her, because the script has told us what the answer to this particular moral quandary is. There is a lot to appreciate about this episode. It's very well paced, there's some good character work, builds up dread very well, and apart from those bits at the ending, even its weaker aspects are just a bit naff rather than being awful. It's a perfectly okay episode, and I'm willing to forgive the fact that as Christmas entertainment it's a bit off the mark. It's still a bit too Doctor Who-y, but that's fine, they didn't know what it needed to be. Overall, I'm just a bit annoyed about the loss of potential here and how much the ending annoys me, but, well, could have been worse. such as most of the Moffat-era specials. I'm awarding The Christmas Invasion a final score of 5 out of 10. I'd say it's average for NuWho. It did have a fighting chance of making that 6 before the ending annoyed me so much, but on the whole, it's fine overall. Has some good stuff in the first half before the second half does let it down. I do appreciate much of what is attempted, and I think if you change around the ending, give a proper conclusion to the character arcs, and actually explore what was brought up instead of lazy telling us what to think, then it would be a hell of a lot better, but as it is, fine, it's average, what do you expect? Christmas mediocrity, what else can you ask for, eh? Anyway, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to all my viewers. Here's to another year of whinging about Doctor Who. See you then.